In this exercise, we're going to work on some stitching practice. This exercise will help you to get used to your machine, get more comfortable with it, how to control the speed, and also be using different stitch lengths. So we have a square, a triangle, and a circle, and we call them concentric because we're actually going to leave the fabric in the machine, and we're going to stitch starting on the outside and continue to stitch on the inside, to the inside, as far as we can go. And we need 2 pieces of this because we want 2 layers of this. And again, we have the grain lines, so we need to cut these out on the straight grain the way they're lined up here. So let's lay out our fabric. And for this exercise, we're actually going to cheat a little bit. I have it, the fabric is fairly well straight. This is a straight grain. I've got my selvages here. We're going to fold it in half like we have here, and we're going to use 2 layers. We wouldn't normally do this in the industry. We cut out a single layer, but because this is mainly for stitching practice and we won't really have a face side to the fabric, we're going to go ahead and cheat a little bit. So 2 layers, fold in half, and then I'm going to start by laying out my square with my grain line parallel to the selvage, and then I will actually line up my, when I get to the point, the triangle, which the length is exactly the same length as the square, straight grain line to the selvage, and then with the circle, I'll just kind of butt it up here, grain line parallel to the selvage or to the previous pattern piece. Now, obviously, we're going to have some waste here, but that's okay. So I'm actually going to start with the square. I'm going to weight it down. I will trace around the square. Okay, I've got the square done. Then I'm going to take my triangle, line that up along that square line. A couple weights to hold that in place. Trace around this triangle. That one's traced. And then I'm going to come up here real close as I can. Straight grain. That looks good. And then I'm going to drag my pencil all the way around the edge. Be careful that you don't drag the fabric too much, so you don't want to drag it and stretch it. Okay. So those are done. Now, when you cut this out, because you have 2 layers, the under layer may move or shift a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a few pins and I'm going to pin on the inside of that fabric to just hold it in place while I'm cutting, especially around here at the points. So let's take this and I'll put it on the inside, not too close, because remember, you still have to get your scissors in there to cut. And when you pin from the inside, always pin with the sharp part of the pin going toward the perimeter of what your pattern piece is. And don't let that point get too close to your cut edge. Okay, so now everything is stabilized. I can go ahead and cut. And I'm gonna just separate these 2 right away. There's no reason why I did that, I just did it. right, now the triangle. Now the circle can be a little bit tricky, but just kind of get in here, start at one angle, and then pivot. Remember to keep your scissors on the table. This point is on the table as you're directing your curve, you're pivoting that around. Refer to the cutting demonstration video if you're still needing help with that. You can stop and turn the fabric. Go slow. And I'm about to finish here, coming back into my original starting point. All right. So there are our shapes. We have a square, a triangle, and a circle. Now, there's technically no face side to this because we're just going to choose which side to start on. But I'm going to go ahead and mark it anyway. You can keep them pinned because both sides are face side. Because we're going to keep them together as we stitch them. Okay, we're ready to go to the machine. So how about some more stitching practice? I have some shapes that we're going to sew concentric lines in. And what that means is that the lines will never stop. They will continue to sew from the outside to the inside, and the lines will get smaller and smaller. So where we're going to start, we're going to start on one of the edges. And what's going to happen is, let me just put a mark here. So since we're doing a 1/4 inch, I'm actually going to mark, okay. So this is a 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to mark a 1/4 inch from that right here. So what's going to happen is I'm going to start here. I'm going to stitch all the way around the square, and I'm going to come back up here. And once I get to this point, I'm not going to meet my beginning stitch. I'm going to actually start another line. Instead of pivoting here, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to come down this way. And then the previous stitch line will be my guide for doing all of the stitching. And I'm not going to mark where my pivot points are. This is a square, so I would have a pivot point here, 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 and then of course back at the original spot. So I'm not going to mark these. I'm going to use my eye, and I'd like you to use your eye as well as far as where you need to stop. And I'll talk you through the first through lines, and then I'm probably going to speed some of the parts up in the video. But where I want you to start, I want you to start here, and I want your stitch length, the dial, to start at a 3. And then as we get into the center, when we have shorter lines, we may be shortening that stitch length. And I'll advise you when we get there. So let's go ahead and get this started. We're going to lift the presser foot, put this fabric in, and start up here where we put our mark, a 1/4 inch mark. Needle down, and I'm going to remove that first pin. And I'm going to sew. Now keep in mind, when you get close up here where you think it's about a 1/4 inch, you're eyeing a 1/4 inch. There's one way you can check that. Needle all the way down, lift the presser foot and pivot. Is it coming out too far away? Remember, about the edge of your presser foot is your 1/4 inch. So I think I can take one more stitch, put it back in the stitch line. I think I can take one more stitch all the way in, and then I can pivot and put the presser. That looks a lot better than it did before. I'm going to remove that pin, and then I'm going to stitch this line, running that cut edge right at the edge of that presser foot. getting close to that 1/4 inch. I'm going to take one more stitch, see where we are. That looks pretty good. Remove this other pin, stitch up to the next corner. Getting close, I'm going to slow down. Let's take one more stitch, see where we are. That looks pretty good. Take this pin out, stitch. So I'm going to stop right here because I'm going to remind you. Now remember, we're not coming back to our starting point here. We're going to come to where we marked it, to that length where we marked it. So I'm still going to run up here, but I marked it here, and maybe you can see better if I mark it to the edge. It's this point here, a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric is where we're going to pivot. So I'll sew up there slowly, right? I can go ahead and hand turn for the needle to be in that spot. This is our new spot, not the original. So then I'm going to pivot, and now I'm going to use this stitch line as my guide, and we'll continue to do that all the way around now. And I'm going to go ahead and quickly just clip these original stitch threads. So now I can use this and stitch. We want to pivot a 1/4 inch away from this, and again, put your needle in. You can judge it. Well, it's a little bit hidden, but it's better than being too far away. But I can slide back out so my stitches come back out, and we'll talk about that in assessment. One more stitch. How does this stitch look? That one looks okay. Let's see what this one looks like. All right. This will give you a feeling for how far away your 1/4 inch really is when you give it a showing you a pivot and then look at where your foot is, where your stitch is. That looks a little shy. It is. You see how far away I am from that? So we'll talk about this in assessment, but I'm not going to go back. Remember, we have the rest of this and we're practicing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch, and then I'm gradually going to pull the fabric over to the side to get that stitch line back over. I can go one more stitch there. It looks too far away. And you'll just keep doing this for the rest. So now that we're back at kind of the beginning side of where we started, we're about halfway in, and we're currently at 3 on our machine. What I want you to do now for this other half, at least for part of the half, is I want you to turn your stitch length dial down to a 2. And we'll see how that feels. How did that make you feel? So we're down at a 2 now, and I'm going to start sewing the rest of this square. And look at that. We've come to the center of the square. I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to trim that off. And so we have a fully stitched concentric square. What I'd like you to do is give this one final press, and then we'll talk about it in assessment. Okay, so we have some more stitching practice. So I have a triangle here, and this is similar to the square. And we're gonna, again, do the concentric stitching lines, but the difference with the square and this that's different from the square is that this is a triangle which the square is really cut in half from. And this edge, if you notice, I have a right angle here. So this is a straight grain, this is the cross grain actually, and this is the straight grain. And this diagonal side is actually cut on the bias, which means that it stretches. So it's going to stretch as you sew. So you'll have to manage that as you sew. So I'm going to make the marks. So I'm going to start up here at this corner. So I'm going to remove this pin. And the pins are there just to hold the 2 layers. Remember, we have 2 layers of fabric, right? So I'm just going to mark my starting point. Right, is a 1/4 inch away from that edge, as we've done previously. So we're going to line this cut edge up with the side of the presser foot, but we're not going to, when we come back around, we're not going to start here. We're going to start a 1/4 inch away. We're going to stop a 1/4 inch away and pivot to get our concentric lines. All right. So we're going to start, put the fabric in a little bit past the needle, needle down, press our foot down, and there's a pin down here, I'm going to remove that because it's going the wrong way. Now I'm going to be careful, I'm going to sew all the way down, and remember we're going to eye where that 1/4 inch is, and the 1/4 inch, this is a different angle than we've seen before. So we're going to kind of eye a 1/4 inch away from here and a 1/4 inch away from the bottom for us to stop. Let's give that an eye. I think that might be good. Put this needle down, and how do we check it? I'm going to actually turn it, and I'm going to pivot. That actually looks pretty good. It looks right up here at the edge. Okay, so practice that. I'm going to remove this other pin that's down here on the other side. Now this is the edge that's going to stretch. So go slow. If you go faster, then this is going to stretch out. So I'm going to go kind of slow to begin with. And again, I'm going to eye where I need to stop for my 1/4 inch away. Slowing down. Let's see what that looks like. That looks a little bit too far out, so I'm going to line this back up. I'm going to give it one more stitch, and then I will pivot it. That looks pretty good. And then I'm going to stitch across. We're coming up to our mark here where we're actually going to stop and pivot. And I think I just have to place the needle spot. All right, so now I can pivot, and I'm going to continue all the way around again. So I'm going to get rid of this extra thread here. And again, once you get smaller and you feel like the stitches aren't short enough to meet this smaller area that's in here, we're going to turn our stitch length down to a smaller stitch length once we get to that spot. So let's go with this again. Eye where that 1/4 inch is going to be. Is that good? We could go a little bit more, but I think that if we go another stitch, it'll be too far. So I'm just going to keep it like this. We're going to eye this. I think I'm going to go maybe just a 1/2 stitch. And then I'm going to turn it, and that looks pretty good. One more stitch. There we go. That looks pretty good. One more stitch, I think. Now, one more note about this edge is that once we have a stitch here, it's fairly set. It really shouldn't stretch a whole lot on this side. It will still stretch, but you won't have to worry about it as much once you get that first stitch line completed. So I'm going to stitch here. One more stitch. Looks good. I'm going to do one more stitch this way and down the other way, and then I think I'm going to change the stitch length. All right, so we're back here on that stretchy side. I'm going to turn the stitch length down to a 2. We'll have a look at what that looks like. We might be able to fit these stitches in a little bit better. That almost lines up perfectly now that I changed that stitch length. One more stitch. think we're about done. And I think I'm just going to take it all the way down to that line. Right? This pulled out, stitched off, and there's our concentric triangle. That one looks pretty good. How do you feel about it? So what I'd like you to do is give this one nice press, and then we'll talk about it in assessment. Okay, so here's another stitching practice exercise. We're going to do, this is a circle, and we're going to do concentric lines within the circle. We're going to start at one point, and then we're going to continue to sew circle lines all the way until we get to the center. So this will be challenging, but you will get to know your machine and how it sews very well. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to start anywhere on the circle, it doesn't matter. I'm going to mark here, up here. Let me get this in the camera for you. So I'm going to mark in anywhere, just a 1/4 inch mark line, 1/4 inch from the edge. And then from that line, I'm going to mark another 1/4 inch. Okay. So we have 2 marks. This here, this first mark is where we're going to start our stitch line. And we're going to follow the edge of this circle, the cut edge, to the edge of our presser foot. And then when we get close to this, instead of coming back to the original stitch line, we're actually going to sew, and we're going to come up, gradually sew to meet this second mark. And then we will use the previous stitch line as a stitching guide. Okay, so let's get started with this. So we're going to put the fabric in, cut edge to the edge of the presser foot at that mark. And we're going to start our stitch length at 3. So put your stitch length dial at 3. And then as we work in smaller, we will make the stitch length smaller. And I will let you know when that will be. Parts of this video for the longer areas I will probably speed up a little bit, but then I will bring it back to normal speed when we change the stitch length. So I'm going to go ahead and start here. Put the needle down. Now to start this is a circle, so we want this cut edge to go always at the edge of our presser foot. So it's going to take 2 hands to do this. I'm going to use one of my hands, my left hand. I'm going to use here at the back of the fabric, and I'm going to be turning the fabric this way. And my other hand, my right hand, I'm going to use in the front of the fabric, guiding it into that spot. So it'll be a turning motion that we're going to be doing with both of our hands. So let's get going here. So ready? Let's go. Turn the fabric, go slow. So I'm turning this way as I'm kind of turning away in the back. Right, and once you get that motion started, you can kind of feel it, and you kind of feel how you're just kind of turning the fabric a little bit away in the back and towards in the front. Once you get more comfortable, try going a little bit faster. And once we get back to about a few inches away, now you can see here, if I lift this up, you can see this is where we need to come back to. So this line here, if we continue on this trajectory, we're going to meet it here. So we need to eye this, so we need to turn a little bit tighter to make it back into this spot. So let's give that a try. So I'm going to come back up into here. So I'm going to turn it a little bit as we go, a little bit further out to come back into that mark. And we made it perfectly. I've got my new stitch line here at the edge of my presser foot, and now I can follow this line all the way around, and it will continue because now we've got a continuous circle that will always be following the previous stitch line. And because of that, I'm going to remove all of the pins that I had the 2 layers pinned to. And just so we don't get anything in the way, I'm just going to clip those threads. All right, you ready to go? So I'm going to just continue following that edge, and I'm turning the back, and I'm guiding the front into that and my eye, what my eye is doing is I'm watching this stitch line. This stitch line, I'm watching it how it's meeting the edge of this presser foot right here, and that's what I'm guiding it to. I think this is a good challenge for beginners and experienced sewers.